had the opportunity to read through the book of Acts at least once this month. And if not, you still have a little bit of time. We don't start Romans until July 1st. And if nothing else, you should read Stephen's speech to the Sanhedrin, which comprises much of chapter 7. Time didn't allow for us to be able to read it in its entirety this morning, but it is a marvelous sweep through Old Testament history and an unprecedented indictment of the Jewish people and how generation after generation they wandered away from God. In fact, Stephen was so full of the Spirit and he spoke so eloquently during that speech that it got him killed, just like Jesus. The religious leaders thought that by killing him, they would put an end to his influential ministry. They were wrong. But before we get to that part of the story, I'd like to just talk for a moment about that odd little description of Stephen given right before he launched into his appeal. It's Acts chapter 6, verse 15, and it was in our first reading for this morning. And this is right after those lying witnesses had spoken about him. It says, "Every member of the Supreme Council focused his gaze on Stephen, for right in front of their eyes, while being falsely accused, his face had become radiant. It appeared to them as the face of an angel." As I was thinking about that, about how something or someone was shining through the face of Stephen, it made me think about this story that I thought I'd like to share with you this morning. It was in February of 2009, and my father had been admitted to the hospital with pneumonia. He was in the advanced stages of his ALS, which meant that while he was there, he couldn't move or talk or eat or even cough with his pneumonia. He was completely paralyzed by that point. The only thing he was physically able to do was blink his eyes. Once for yes, twice for no. That's how we communicated with him by that point. Though we didn't know it at the time, he had only a few weeks left to live. One day, during that hospital stay, a new doctor came to do the rounds. She was part of the same medical practice as my father's primary doctor, but neither he nor my mom had ever seen her before. She just happened to be the one on call that day. So she introduced herself, checked his vital signs, said a few words, and then she was gone. The whole encounter lasted less than 3 minutes. 16 months later, my mom decided to change doctors in that same medical practice, and she made an appointment with a doctor who'd come to check on my dad that day. She hadn't seen her before or since those few moments in the hospital. So she was floored. When the doctor came into the room, looked at her for a brief second and said, "Are you Ken's wife?" Shocked, my mother replied, "Yes, but how could you possibly remember that?" And the doctor said, "There are just some patients you never forget." When my mom told me this story, I was equally shocked. Some patients you never forget? What had there been to remember? She spent a few minutes in a room with a dying man who couldn't move or smile or talk. And this was just one patient in a sea of patients she must have seen in the ensuing 16 months. Yet even after all that time, she remembered him so well that she instantly recalled his name. I wondered how that could be possible. And then I read this chapter about Stephen. In verse 8, Stephen is referred to as a man full of God's grace and power. In verse 10, it says that those who came looking to discredit him could not stand against the wisdom and the spirit with which he spoke. That's why he was hauled in before the Sanhedrin. Some of his enemies had cooked up a little false testimony in order to destroy his ministry and message because they just couldn't find an honest way to stand against truth. So there's Stephen before the high council. And the false witnesses have finished all their testimony, accusing him of crimes against the temple and the law of Moses. And now it's Stephen's turn to reply. But before he could even say a word, he was apparently already testifying. For right in front of their eyes, his face had become radiant, and it appeared to them as the face of an angel. Even before Stephen opened his mouth, he was already witnessing, already proclaiming the truth to those members of the Sanhedrin. Did they ever forget him? Could they ever forget that moment? I doubt it. Stephen was a man full of God's grace and power, and there is no hiding God. I like to think that's maybe why the doctor remembered my father all those many months later, because he also was a man full of God's grace and power. And when God is living within you, he shines through. That means if God has taken up residence in your life, you're a witness, even when you aren't aware of it. You don't have to talk. You don't have to walk. You don't have to do anything in order for God to be seen. If he is in you, he will shine through. He was shining in the face of Stephen that day. And when the members of the Sanhedrin turned to him to hear his reply to the charges, I'm sure they weren't expecting what they got. They were probably anticipating some sort of defense. What they got was a punch in the gut. The high priest, who was still Caiaphas, by the way, asked Stephen, "Are these accusations true?" And Stephen replied, "Oh, brothers and fathers, listen to me. Our glorious God appeared to our ancestor Abraham while he was in Mesopotamia before he ever came to live in Haran." And from there, Stephen launched into his impassioned speech about the faithfulness of God and the faithlessness of God's people. He didn't waste 1 second on answering the trumped-up charges or trying to defend himself. God had given him a tremendous opportunity to speak to the very people who had plotted and carried out the execution of Christ. And he spoke so powerfully that in the end, they were only left with 2 options. Concede to everything Stephen had said, or destroy him. I mean, imagine standing in front of Caiaphas, the high priest, no more than 90 days after he had personally orchestrated the events that led to the death of Jesus, and proclaiming, "Look, I see the heavens opened and the Son of Man standing in the place of honor at God's right hand." In other words, that guy you thought you destroyed is now in the highest position of the very kingdom you claim to promote. Can you imagine having that kind of boldness? No wonder they stoned him. And that was the end of Stephen and his ministry, the end of his evangelism, the end of the gospel mission he was so passionate about. Or was it? Saul, who was a member of the Sanhedrin, was in full agreement with Stephen's murder. And after they had stoned him, a full-scale assault was launched against the believers in Jerusalem, and Saul began to destroy the church. Going from house to house, he dragged off both men and women and put them in prison. When that started to happen, the believers scattered. They escaped from Jerusalem and went all throughout Judea and Samaria, and they preached the gospel wherever they went. They preached the gospel wherever they went. At this point, don't you get the sense that the Jewish elders and chief priests and religious leaders trying to fight against God's purpose is a bit like watching that wily coyote try to destroy the roadrunner? You seen those cartoons recently? We watched them a lot in our house. Bless that coyote's heart. No matter what he does, it backfires. Whatever he tries, it always blows up in his face. The Sanhedrin thought that stoning Stephen was going to be the beginning of the end for the church. Instead, it was like lighting a fuse under a gospel bomb that produced an explosion literally heard around the world. As the persecution scattered the believers, they ran to the ends of the earth. And as they ran to the ends of the earth, they told everyone they met the good news about God. Instead of the gospel remaining hidden and sheltered there in Jerusalem, it was flung far and wide to every nation and kindred and tongue and people. As Stephen was being stoned to death that day, I think it would have been so tempting for him to think that this was the end. And who knows, maybe he did. But if he did, the rest of us know that he was wrong. His death wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. God turned the circumstances of his martyrdom into the occasion to spread the good news to the whole world. In fact, when you consider that Stephen's one great passion was to make sure he told as many people as possible about Jesus, you kind of have to conclude that God actually used the circumstances of his death to fulfill his greatest wish in life. Let's not miss the importance of that realization. God actually used the circumstances of Stephen's death to fulfill his greatest wish in life. That is the power of God. The power of his work in suffering. And let me assure you, God is also at work in your suffering. He's at work in your family's suffering. He is at work in every single situation of suffering you see around you in the world. It doesn't matter how the suffering happened or where it came from. God's going to use it to do something stunning. And how do I know that? Because of Stephen. If God could work through his suffering to accomplish something he's going to be amazed by, then we can trust that God is doing the same thing for us right now, even when we can't see it. After Stephen was gone, Saul became a first-hand witness to the incredible good that God brings out of suffering. And I'm sure he couldn't wait to meet Stephen again, hug him, and fill him in on the rest of the story. Just imagine being in heaven and meeting the person who presided over your execution. And not only that, imagine learning that the person who presided over your execution eventually did everything in his power to carry on your life's work. That's what I love about the faces in the Rembrandt painting. That Stephen and Saul had the same face. That God took what Saul had done to Stephen and used it to ultimately implant Stephen's passion into Saul. We're going to talk about that next week. Someday soon, Stephen is going to learn the rest of the story. And in the meantime, you remember too that your own suffering is going to have a rest of the story. Because God is at work even now in the most difficult circumstances of your life. That is the power of God. Whenever it looks like things are coming to an end, God has a new beginning up his sleeve. Whenever it looks like a cross and a tomb, God has an Easter Sunday morning right around the corner. God is always at work in the midst of suffering, always taking what has been meant for evil and harm and turning it for good. And if you know that, then you know that you can trust him with every hurt, every pain, every tear, and every hardship. Just like Stephen did.